Well, good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. I'm delighted to be here and to be in the company of a number of you who I've met last year when I was invited to speak, and want to acknowledge President Rogers, Provost Porter, Dean Shapiro, and of course my dear colleague Dr. Orlando Taylor, who invited Janet and me to get back together. We haven't seen, well, we saw each other at the conference, yeah, but Janet and I were sorting out how long we've known each other in terms of our careers, and it goes back to about 1983 when we were just getting out of graduate school or something like that. It's supposed to be funny. I really have just contextually shared, spent a lot of my career looking at issues of diversity and inclusion from an organizational level. My scholarship has been in the area of competencies and guidelines, multicultural competencies and guidelines, issues, mental health issues for Latinas and Latinos, women's leadership, and so forth. And at the same time, all of this is preceded by my attention to organizations and how organizations are inclusive or exclusive. And I share that because education for me is really a very strong platform for socialization. And Dr. Helms really pointed that out in terms of how easy it is to conform when the dominant culture in whether it's public education or higher education is a white model. So conformity is really what happens in higher education as well because of the way we're socialized. So when I think about current issues of diversity and inclusion, I say a couple of things. First of all, I did a number of years of private work as a consultant in the private sector. And this was from about 1987 to 1999. And I was on the East Coast at the time. And I will tell you that it was much easier to work with corporations, people in the private sector, than it was with higher education. The denial in higher education then is still alive and well in some places in higher education. Okay? It was that kind of academic egotism. We do things, we are educators. And it was hard to move that button until we started working with data, which is what I'll be talking about as well this evening. So I say all of this because my interest really is in how organizations can change. And I really applaud the work that Stephen reported on as far as how it has taken iterations and the work is never done. As long as you have a strategic approach to follow, I think you can be able to see change, measure change, and have change sustain over time. That's important to an organization. For the last few years, I've been working with two organizations that are designed to develop higher education leaders. The American Council on Education, which is out of Washington, D.C. Has anyone been part of that program, the Fellows Program with ACE? Well, one of your folks has. Dr. Monique Snowden has just finished that program, so I got to engage with her there. And the other program is out of the University of Michigan. It's called the National Center for Inclusive Diversity, the National Center for Inclusive Diversity. And they have partnered with the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education. All I can tell you is both programs are different from each other in ways that is foundational. And I will say to you that ACE has more of the predominantly white institution framework, and NCID is really working to make itself much more 21st century, thinking about unconscious bias, race in higher education, and talking about it, we're using the language that needs to be used. We're not avoiding the language. Oh, those leadership experiences are terribly important because we're talking about developing the future leaders in higher education, be they provost, deans, or presidents. And what people learn is what they bring to the institution. And some of my comments may come out as sounding critical of higher education leaders, but it's really, I think what Janet said as well, kind of the schema people have and how that schema gets transferred across generations through the educational programs, oftentimes put up as leadership programs for future leaders. So, just coming back now to what I'm supposed to talk about here, and I should look at my time. But I always have to do context in order to have some of this be relevant. What I see as some of the current issues, and there are many current issues, but I really see that we've regressed as a society, as a nation. We've really regressed from our whole attitude, you know, the Statue of Liberty of welcoming and valuing differences among people. So we've come back to almost what I found was going on in the 1880s, was the American Protective Association movement. I did a lot of study of immigrants for my dissertation. So the American Protective movement came about as an anti-immigration movement. And ironically, it was also an anti-Catholic organization, but primarily of Irish people from Canada. That infiltrated the Midwest. Oh, you can see how I think differences and how different kinds of identities begin to conflict and contrast over the centuries. I think another current issue is inequities have become normative. You know, we've come out of the war on poverty, and we're looking at more people in poverty today than were at the 30, 40 years ago. There's the incidence of poverty has increased. There are fewer people in the middle class who are really considered middle class from a financial standpoint. So the inequities have continued to increase. I also think that we have seen across campuses, and I'll share with you headlines in a couple minutes, we've seen across US campuses this year, last couple of years, a lot of challenges for leadership. We can talk about the University of Missouri, we can talk about Yale, Claremont or Pomona, one of those colleges out there, where there has perhaps what I would say superficial recognition has been given to diversity and inclusion. And when there's that superficial recognition, it actually creates more dissent. Because students are smart. Students actually recognize what is real, when there is going to be real transparency. And that what we're seeing is, I think leadership often is uncomfortable in addressing historically marginalized groups, particularly students of color. And we see this as an increase on the campuses. And oftentimes, the issues are color and cultural identity dynamics. Color and cultural identity dynamics are the focus. Now, it's happening in higher education because it's happening in society as a whole. Okay, so we're never separate from society. If you've studied the work of Gerd Hastede, and he talks about national values, how national values pervade organizations. And so what we're seeing is that sense of collectivism, but the collectivism identity is more around, the white dominant culture. So the other is the person of color or a person of some other marginalized group, be they of lower socioeconomic status. And this is presenting a lot of issues on college campuses today. Here are some of the daily headlines, and I read Inside Higher Education just about every day. I don't read it in depth, but I check out the headlines on Inside Higher Education or the Chronicle of Higher Ed to decide what story I'm going to read. So I kind of ran a scan on diversity-related topics of the last few months. And among these are ones that I think are very salient, and these are, challenges that I think campuses are trying to address. The University of the Redlands is helping men to be their authentic selves. Now, it's really about how to have dialogues about what it means to be a man. Now, there's more to it than that, but I'm just giving you the headlines of what is going on different campuses. Of course, at Yale, they decided to keep the name of Calhoun Hall. Remember, that was that big controversy. But they used to have the people who were managing the house as the masters of the house, so they did away with the word master. So I guess they compromised a little bit. But look at the racial embeddedness of the language. It's the structure of the language. And then this was one that I don't know if you read about this one. It didn't get a whole lot of press. At the University of Wisconsin in Madison, an African-American student had painted some graffiti that had to do with Black Lives Matter. And somebody found out who he was. So the police went into the class to arrest him. Now, big drama. It was graffiti. It was something that could have waited, but it created even more upset for the way this was handled. So again, I think about it from the different levels of an organization. It's not just that the president has to be responsive, but how people who are in fact in key roles of enacting leadership, how they behave, because they don't really recognize their biases and assumptions. And then, of course, this is another one that happened at St. Louis University, which is a private Jesuit university. And the baseball players, the team was having some very open discussions and having social media conversations that was very racist in nature. And the university at first said that they could not be punished because we were a private university and their conversations were sort of protected. But there was enough pushback and outburst that the players did get, I guess, their hands slapped. But the point was that these are all about leadership issues, and these send messages to students, they send messages to communities about how racism is not addressed or not addressed well. And then in the latest July 8th, just about a week ago, one of the headlines is there's a lack of support for affirmative action, that is growing, the lack of support for affirmative action. Again, a backlash to the Fisher finding. Okay, so we're living all of this. This is not 1967 or 1985. We're living this right now in the 21st century. And higher education institutions have, again, a greater and greater responsibility to have dialogues about these current issues, because you as faculty, staff, and students, and myself here, we all go out and face these, and we have to be responsive to, in my case, to students and to communities. Oops, I'm going backwards, okay. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to think about addressing diversity and inclusion institutionally, because that's the kind of work I've done. I always believe we have to follow a roadmap with incremental actions and processes. It's not a sprint. It's never a sprint, but we have to have a roadmap to follow in order to know that these steps that we're taking are incremental, that they're measurable, and that what we're hoping to achieve will sustain over time. We need to define the terms that we use, and Janet mentioned that. In order to really make sure we're all having the same conversation. What do we mean by people of color? What do we mean by diverse? What do we mean by marginalized, underrepresented? Well, you have to have sometimes a glossary in order to really have a shared understanding of the terms. From the very beginning, Steve, I don't know how this has been with your all of the plans that you've worked for diversity, but you have to have a very good communication plan from the beginning, so that people know along the way how this is progressing, what you're attempting to do, and how it is evolving, how it's progressing. In all the organizations I've worked, the communication plan was key to people feeling included, people feeling that somebody wasn't in a dark room doing this, plan, and that they were never going to see, it was not going to see the light of day, or they would not know how it was going to affect them. So the communication from the beginning, using data to inform the plan, cultural climate surveys that are behavioral are ideal, and I'll give you some examples of statements for cultural climate studies. And goal clarification for functional areas, departments, and behaviors. All of the cultural climate work I've done has been very behavioristic. People can say, I believe, but that doesn't mean that what they say they believe that they're going to enact. Okay, so we want to have things that are measurable. I'll get to that. This is the blueprint for organizational diversity that I developed a number of years ago. As I said, I did a lot of organizational consulting, and people would come to me and they'd say, we want to work on a diversity initiative, and we have about 6 months. And I'd say, in 6 months we can begin to prepare. And believe me, I almost have it to a science that it takes 6 months to get people convened, get people to understand what we're trying to accomplish, to empower people to lead the work, because I'm leaving. And you don't just turn it over to the CEO. So we have the preparing for an initiative. You have the next step, which is part of this, is articulating a vision for what you want the institution to say, to mean when it comes to inclusion and diversity. Mind you, this is 1996, so I probably need to make my terminology a little more current too. But you can see I was working with corporations. We wanted to clarify the business motivators. Why were we really doing this? And I think higher ed would also have to clarify the motivators. In those days we would say, well, it's the right thing to do. Okay, right. It's good for the bottom line, people would say. Or it's a good moral thing, But you really have to be very clear about what it is you're trying to achieve. What is motivating you? Is it that you really, you want to have the students who graduate from Fielding be known for their depth of knowledge when it comes to social justice, and how that applies in practice, how that applies in consultation, how that applies in teaching? I mean, what is it that's going to differentiate you, Fielding Graduate University, from other professional schools? So that's where clarifying the motivators comes in. Some companies would say, we really want to be known as a company that values diversity and that we attract people to come here because we put that into practice. Things like that. Gathering data is the important one, and I'll talk about that. Then we would have a strategic plan for our diversity initiative coming out of the data, coming out of the motivators. And then we'd have the implementation and measuring for impact. So you can see this is not a 6-month plan. This evolves over time, but the preparation for it is really where the investment comes. That's where the investment comes, in the preparation side. All right. So then we look at some of the components of a multiculturally oriented organization, or an organization that is inclusive and diverse. We look at some of these in an organization. Any of you who are in OD work, you want to pay attention to the mission, but also what the belief systems are in that organization. What are the belief systems that were the best at producing graduate students in psychology? Is that part of your belief system? Or your belief system that people are genuinely good people, and that's why we're in this business? Your core values, your core leadership. And then we look at some of the organizational practices and how those are enacted. So there's more to all of this. And I think it's on the handout, maybe. Okay, there are also areas to address. Once you gather data from your cultural climate study, the areas to address would be your curriculum, classroom behavior, professional development, interpersonal relations and communications, community relations and alumni. How does the local community perceive Fielding Graduate University? Or if you tell somebody, let's say you're in Boston or in Chicago or in Texas, and you say, I'm attending Fielding Graduate University, Do they have an association to fielding that is, I never heard of it, or do they have one that's really positive? I mean, those are important things to think about in terms of community relations, and those of you who are going to become alum or are alum here. And then we look at some other areas that data can talk to us about. Okay, now this is something that you're going to do. On a scale of 1 to 5, highly agree, highly disagree. So you're going to highly agree 1, highly disagree 5. Okay, and you don't have to shout it out or anything, but think for yourself. My personal self-confidence has increased since I joined fielding. My personal self-confidence has increased since I joined fielding. Highly agree, highly disagree. I feel I have voice that is heard by my professors. I feel I have voice that is heard by my professors. Highly agree, highly disagree. The social climate of the university is welcoming and comfortable for students of different religious affiliations. Highly agree, highly disagree. Discrimination and or harassment of students based on race and or ethnicity are not a problem at fielding. Highly agree, highly disagree. I have the equipment that allows me to meet my work responsibilities. I have the equipment that allows me to meet my work responsibilities. Highly agree, highly disagree. Supervision is done respectfully and periodically. Supervision is done respectfully and periodically. Highly agree, highly disagree. Okay. What did you think of these items? Did they tell you a little bit about the climate of an institution? In this case, some of this applies to fielding. I put it in the context of fielding. You know, and some of you would, I can't imagine that everyone's going to respond the same, because some of you are faculty, some of you are administrators, some of you are staff, some of you are women, some of you are men, some of you are African American, some of you are gay and lesbian or lesbian. I mean, I can go down all of the social identities, and we will respond to these items often informed by our social identities as well as our experiences. And so the climate studies that we have carried out have really tried to understand how people experience the work environment or the institutional environment through their lens. And we learn a lot. I mean, these are just sample items that you can see. What we've learned in our studies, though, is that by and large, women and men see things differently. You know, women will feel much more exclusionary or marginalized or disempowered behaviorally based on how they're treated. You know, men get the cherry-picked assignments, women do not. Okay. Person of color will more often feel marginalized than a white person. A person in a clerical staff role will also feel much more the other based on how people communicate with him or her than someone in administration. Very important to get these range of perspectives. And none of it, again, it's not a good or a bad, but it's to understand that the climate in an organization affects people differentially. And until you get the data, it's very hard to draw any conclusions. It's very hard to make some plans that say we're going to, you know, assure that all the faculty endorse cultural competence, because you don't know that they don't all endorse it, but you also need to understand how people experience the faculty in the classroom and what gets talked about. So these are some of the behaviors that are captured in climate surveys. Now, what are some of the pitfalls when we're doing organizational development work that focuses on diversity and inclusion? Well, that we have an expectation that people will change based on good intentions, okay? And I think whether it's Steve or Janet that said this already, you know, people will agree to the whole concept of a diversity initiative, or let's value diversity, let's work on diversity, inclusion, and social justice. But good intentions do not translate into behavior. We often ignore data, or perhaps don't get the data. The qualitative data needs to be also gathered as well as quantitative. I talked about the comprehensive communication strategy. And also we're talking, I mean, I think anybody who embarks on a diversity initiative or a diversity plan is really talking about culture change. You're talking about organizational culture change, and that takes time. Organizational culture change takes time, and it requires behavioral consequences. And finally, I think we have to have a mindset that the work around creating inclusion and diversity in an organization is not a task. It is not a task. It's not an assignment. It's a long-term process. It is a long-term process. Well, some of my suggested directions, and this again, thank you, Steve, for sharing some of us with us your work. I would say review some of the actions to date in reference to the blueprint that I just shared with you. Update the current fielding strategic plan and identify 3 to 4 priorities, a few short-term tasks within the next 5 months. There you go, that's your assignment. Just, you know, don't try and take it all on. You know, just a few short-term tasks. I don't know, Janet, you brought it up, the whole issue about how students are reacting to what's going on campuses right now. And you don't close down, but you know, some places don't have summer classes or don't have a very active student cohort in the summer. Last weekend, I'm a visiting professor at ASU, and I happened to be on campus last week, and the students convened themselves. They have an organization called the Social Justice League. And they asked me to consult to them when they started it I was there last spring, the Social Justice League. And they convened whoever wanted to come to talk about what had been going on last week, what happened last week in Baton Rouge and Dallas and Minneapolis. And I went. And there was one other faculty member and 6 students. And you know, it was a space for us to just reflect. It wasn't heavy duty, but you know, it was a discourse. And I think if there can be a way that spaces like that are provided for students to have a conversation. And it doesn't have to, as I say, lead to anything, but it's a space to reflect and to talk. We used to do that at the Chicago School too, when we had the Trayvon Martin issue. Case came up, and another one after that. So I think that could be a short-term one. I would also say engage in benchmarking. See what other universities are doing. And I don't think anyone has it right, but there may be some practices at other institutions, and maybe some of you who are students were at another university where you saw some attention to inclusion and diversity that you thought could work here at a graduate school. Now, this is more than you've asked for, but I think you have a strong program in organizational leadership, educational leadership. You know, no one, to my knowledge, has created a certificate program in organizational diversity strategy. You know, this is something that everybody needs right now. You know, they have these year-long programs, ACE and CID, but a certificate program where people could actually get the knowledge and the skills and go put it into practice. Partner with other institutions as well to develop underrepresented leaders from underrepresented groups. And I also suggest review some of the Lumina Foundation and other foundations. Lumina has a project that takes it to the year 2025 called A Stronger Nation, and it's about opening the pipeline from K-12 to higher education. But I think what it's really clear about is how that pipeline needs to be nurtured, and it's not going to be happening only in that public school setting. It has to be the K through 16 approach in order to ensure that those students have an opportunity to have a successful life as well. And to that end, I wanted to make sure, and Janet didn't bring it up, but she talked about the different social identity groups. And you know, if you, I always believe you have to read what's going on in the press, whether you like it or not, okay? Because the societal issues are very much part of our higher education experience. But one headline that got me in the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday was the Latino election roll grows. The Latino election roll grows. And you are seeing a higher percentage of Latinos in higher education, percentage-wise, entering higher education than any other group right now. And they're of an age right now where they were born in the States, they're old enough to vote, and each year that increases. So what we're seeing that in major states across the country, but I think that's something else to think about in terms of whether it's the curriculum or just how you think about relationships with future students or with other Hispanic serving institutions, organizations like that. I think that's it. Well, thank you very much.